Okay, well, welcome everyone. I think we're ready to start this 4th virtual training. We welcome you all and appreciate all of your participation in the webinar trainings that we've had. My name is Emily Lockard. I'm an extension agent here in Montezuma County, and I will be guiding us along this Friday journey, talking about drought management with crops, as well as my colleague to the north, Gus Westerman. And so I'm just going to start with a few little housekeeping things to get us started here. And to start that with, we may have some good or bad internet connections. And so I want you to know that this presentation is being recorded, and all of the presentations have been recorded and are on the website that you can view later. Unfortunately, if Zoom bombing is a thing, we'll shut down the webinar and then we will send you a link for a different meeting space. We ask that you, keep muted unless during discussion times to unmute yourself, and please ask questions, type those in the chat. If you're a problem, we will reserve the right to kick you out there. On this chat, we're going to ask you some questions, and if you want to remain anonymous, you can do that by changing your name to little ... there. And if you have any questions or need any technical assistance, there is Michaela's phone number. So Michaela's part of Drought Advisors, and you can contact her through that phone number with any questions that you may have. And we do have some continuing education credits. So if you have requested those, you should have received an email from Retta. And if you haven't, then you can contact her as well. So just a little bit about Drought Advisors. We are a partnership among a lot of different organizations. So we have those listed there. And this entire series is funded by the Colorado Department of Agriculture. So we are really appreciative of all the different partnerships that we have as a part of this organization. And so here's a little picture. Michaela put this together. Thank you, Michaela, of our core planning team there. And there's us smiling, our little faces on Zoom as we often meet. So thank you to our wonderful fearless leader, Retta, as well as Harrison there, who have really been leading the way, and all of the support Michaela has given this through her work. And then we have Julie Elliott, myself, Gus Westerman, Greg Felson, Amber Weber, Jenny Byerman, Jill, Greg Peterson, and Lauren. And just real big thank you to everybody who's been a part of this planning team. So what is Drought Advisors, who is a part of putting on this workshop? Our mission is to remove barriers and share drought coping strategies within individual operations by working holistically as a network to ensure those needs are met. And we have a vision to build short and long-term resilience for drought among Colorado producers by working with farmers and ranchers to connect resources, identify, assess risk, and implement practices that lessen the impact of drought. And so we hope this series is a part of meeting that mission and vision. And so here we are in our drought leadership training. We're today at that virtual training number 4, and then we have our in-person final trainings that will be next week in Grand Junction, and then the 15th and 16th on the East Slope. So we do look forward to seeing all of you who have signed up for those trainings at that time. To give you a little preview of, this is our agenda for today. So we have 4 wonderful speakers lined up for you. And I think before we get into those speakers, then I'm going to hand this to Retta for her to kind of get us started in grounding us, as she has for all of these webinars, talking about drought planning. So take it away, Retta.
All right. I think something got weird. Okay, we're getting back on track. Last time my mic or my mouse decided to run out of batteries right when I did this. So I think I need to switch my screens. All right, so you're seeing the right screen now, is that right? Okay, thanks, great. So yeah, I'm Retta Brugger. I'm the regional specialist in range management for CSU Extension in Western Colorado. And as I've done before, I'm going to be talking today about just grounding us in how the content we're going to hear about today relates to a larger drought planning framework. And apologize, this is the fourth time you've heard it if you've been on all the webinars, but hopefully it just drives that point home about what we're learning today and how that fits into a broader picture. Before I get there, I wanted to read our principles of community that we have at CSU. These are principles that express what our community stands for and guides our expectations for each other. I think they're important in terms of we are a community of learners here, and in order to be able to create an atmosphere where people are able to learn, people need to be able to come as themselves. And with that, our language is that we welcome, affirm, and value many identities as part of CSU. So along those lines, our principles are inclusion. We create and nurture environments, or we create and nurture inclusive environments and welcome, value, and affirm all members of our community, including their various identities, skills, ideas, talents, and contributions. Integrity. We are accountable for our actions and will act ethically and honestly in all of our interactions. Respect, we honor the inherent dignity of all people within an environment where we are committed to freedom of expression, critical discourse, and the advancement of knowledge. Service, we are responsible individually and collectively to give of our time, talents, and resources to promote the well-being of each other and the development of local, regional, and global communities. And finally, social justice. We have the right to be treated and the responsibility to treat others with fairness and equity, and the duty to challenge prejudice and to uphold the laws, policies, and procedures that promote justice in all respects. So I think I wanted to share these today because of some comments that were made in the last webinar, and just reiterate that the community that we're trying to form is one that I think these principles underlie and speak to. So with that, back to drought, my favorite topic. So, just reiterating, when we asked you why you're attending these webinar series, many of us had the same goals. We wanted to have more tools and resources to cope with drought, and we wanted to be able to assist potentially ourselves if we're producers, but also others in terms of drought information and resources to increase our capacity to deal with drought in Colorado. Drought is a unique kind of challenge that we face in agriculture. Well, maybe it's not that unique, but there's some characteristics of it that make it a particularly challenging problem. We can't make it go away. We don't know when it's going to stop and start. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty associated with drought, and I think we heard that last week loud and clear in terms of, you can make a decision in a drought that may then not serve you well depending on what happens in the future in terms of cattle prices, for example. So there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Generally, we don't like it. And there's lots of ways to tell us there is a drought, but we also, in our context, we want to be able to move that ball forward. We all know there's a drought. How do we build resilience to drought? So we've talked about on this webinar, hoping for rain is not a drought strategy, but it's this particular kind of problem that you probably can't just throw a silver bullet at and solve it, right? So what is a reasonable framework for thinking about how to respond to drought as a particular kind of challenge? In the context of our program, we really focus on drought planning and drought contingency planning. So that comes down to, I've said before, two elements, if and then. If there's a drought, what are you going to do? How's it going to impact you? In other words, a drought plan just outlines what you're going to do and when you're going to do it in the case of drought. Next week and the week after in our extended 2-day program, we'll really dive a lot deeper, but I think this is a good way to just think in more simplistic forms about what drought planning is. So the first webinar that we had, if you break down the if and then, we could talk about goals, triggers, and strategies. Our first webinar, we focused in on what I would call triggers, specifically how you might apply planning forecasts or forecast to a planning framework. We then dived into strategies in the last two webinars. And sorry, I just got a weird message, but yeah, we dived into strategies in the last two webinars. The second webinar, we dived into financial strategies and risk management from that perspective. In the last one, we had 4 ranchers come on and talk about some of the strategies that they use with regards to drought. Finally, today we're going to dive into crops management, in which we will hear from 4 speakers on strategies and decisions they've made in drought to deal with that particular type of, or those particular types of cropping systems. So that is all I was going to say. I will now, as in many other meetings, launch the polls if I can get there.
Retta, I don't see polls, but do you want me to introduce our first speaker or?
Yes, something super weird just happened. So I can launch the polls. I just got a message that I was kicked out of the Zoom. And so I had no idea that I thought I had been talking to myself for the past 5 minutes. So hopefully we all learn that later, but I've launched the polls. If you don't mind participating again, these just highlight some of the things we think the speakers are going to speak about today. All right, we're at 45% participation. So we'll shoot a little higher than that. And apologize to everyone. From my end of the screen, it really looked like I had been kicked out of Zoom and that I was talking to myself, but Emily has informed me that I was here the whole time. So explain that if you can, but I can't.
It's always something new.
Yeah. All right. Looks like we're capping out at about 45% participation. I don't see a whole lot more coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and share the results. Maybe people are having the problem I had where they really are talking to no one in a room, but you can see here our speakers. Maybe this gives you a sense of where folks are in the audience. So we asked, how confident are you in your knowledge on how to maximize efficiency in irrigation water for your crops during drought? Lots of us are in the somewhat confident category. How confident are you in your knowledge of critical times for maximum production for a particular crop? Again, somewhat confident, although yeah, 42% of us are not at all confident. So Joe, you got your work cut out for you. During drought, how confident are you in the accuracy of how you measure irrigation water? Pretty split evenly there between not at all confident and somewhat confident. And how confident are you in your knowledge of strategies that would work to conserve soil moisture in a cropping system? Ron, you got some work cut out for you as well there with looks like 75% between somewhat and not at all confident. And then finally, how confident are you in prioritizing certain fields versus others with limited irrigation water? And we have about 37% somewhat confident, 37% not at all confident. So I will stop sharing and hand it back over to Emily and Gus.
Okay, well, thank you, Retta, and I will introduce the first speaker here, and hopefully that is showing correctly for you all there. Oops. Okay, so our first speaker today is Dr. Jose Chaves, and so very thankful that he's here with us. He is an associate professor in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at CSU, and also an irrigation specialist with Extension. And he has a vast background teaching with research and service with Extension, and also with research responsibilities as well. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Jose, and you can take it from here.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'm glad to be here for this talk. I will share my screen now. Okay, do you see my screen? Okay, thank you. Yes, so I'll be talking about different technologies available for irrigation water use, I would say determination or monitoring, tracking, and well, this serves to optimize the water management, given the limited resources. So this is a very busy slide, but you have different inputs to the system, right? So the system being the root zone where water is going to be stored. And there are different technologies for determining the inputs and outputs. But we are very interested in the change in water in the soil. Change in soil water storage is taking into account the inflows and outflows, right? So some methods are simpler to determine the main output of the system, which is done by the plants with the evapotranspiration process. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And others are geared towards determining this change in water mass, or the water amount in the soil. So those two different available technology we'll be touching on today. You most likely have seen this type of diagram before, where you have the soil volume where the roots are, and you have saturation level when all the pores are filled. Well, our target is to keep the water, when irrigating, the water close to fill capacity and allowing it to be depleted to only a certain level. That's the threshold for irrigation, for triggering irrigation back, right? And that threshold is, I guess, determined by our management allowed depletion. And that is depending on the crop you're growing, the sensitivity to drought. Yes. Of course, for that, we need to know volumetric water contents for fill capacity, and when the plants no longer are able to remove water from the soil, which is the wilting point. And for more crops, that management allowed depletion changes from 0.15 to 0.5. More row crops are closer to 0.5, 0.4 to 0.5, and vegetables and fruits that are more sensitive to lack of water are closer to 1.2, 1.25, let's say. But the idea is to track the depletion of water in the soil. And we saw that before, and through this graph as well, it's good to know where are the inputs and outputs of this system. So the inputs will be the precipitation, P, and the irrigation water. So it's very good practice to measure precipitation with a rain gauge and irrigation water as much as possible. And of course, we have, as I mentioned before, the main output through the plants is the evapotranspiration. And we'll talk about that, how to do this soil water balance. And this is a simplified version of it. So one way to estimate or track the crop water use is through the crop coefficients, like the FAO 56 approach, where they have studied through different weighing lysimeters approaches, what is that crop coefficient. So that the crop coefficient is the ratio of a given crop water use to a reference crop, the reference being alfalfa or grass. And of course, they have established reference evapotranspiration for alfalfa grass equations based on weather variables, right? For weather stations that are set on agricultural fields. So this is one way to estimate. So in this picture to the right, you see this kind of magenta color, which is the output the equation using the crop coefficient and the reference UT. But for most cases, this is for no stress, for no water limitation. That's where this approach works better. And we have one extension publication that explains better this approach. It gives examples of the crop coefficients, how to apply them. And these are alfalfa-based reference evapotranspiration coefficients, and applying these soil water balance inputs and outputs to estimate water used by plants. And you may be aware of this tool called WISE, the Water Irrigation Scheduler for Efficient Application, that is available online. It's free to be used. And you can draw a polygon or like any shape of polygon once you locate your field, and will extract the soil characteristics and the nearest weather station data, calculate the reference evapotranspiration, and bring crop coefficients and so on. And you have the capability of measure water content or deficits there as well to improve better the output, and they'll do that deficit tracking, the water deficits in the soil for you. Well, so that's one way, using crop coefficients to estimate the evapotranspiration. The other way is using the soil water content sensors. You see a picture to the right here, the upper right corner. This is the so-called TDR, time domain reflectometer, which is, I would say, a very good technology, very accurate. It gives you volumetric water content, like cubic feet per cubic feet of water per soil, and soil temperature, and the bulk electrical conductivity. It's good to track salinity in the soil as well. So typical practice is to install sensors spread out through the root zone, depending if you have layer soils, or how homogeneous is your soil, but covering the root zone. And these sensors come with a calibration from the manufacturer, but from time to time, it's good to do your own calibration using gravimetric sampling methods, which help a lot be more accurate. And then this D here in this equation is tracking the depletion by doing the difference of volumetric water content using the measurement of the sensors in relations to the field capacity. And this FC up here, the green dashed line, would be the field capacity. And the field capacity is defined as that water content in the soil after natural drainage has occurred, what is there. And of course, before we have the maximum allowed depletions, we're going to be tracking this deficit until we are near to that allowed deficit in the soil to trigger irrigation again. And when we have those layer soils and different sensors across the root zone, then we have to do this calculation of deficit per layer and then aggregate them to know how much water to apply to bring the soil deficit back zero, back to field capacity. But also if there is a limitation in water resources or drought condition, these technologies that we are showing here, including the soil water content sensor-based approach, serves to document what has happened in the field, what was the stress, the lack of water in there. We'll talk more about that. Another approach is using remote sensing, and this is called a proximal remote sensing technique to calculate the CWSI, or crop water stress index, using this infrared thermometer data, or IRTs. There are handheld, and also it could be fixed on a post. And here is showing in degrees C, and we have in 5 year in Fahrenheit the temperature. There are different sensors out there commercially available. We need to avoid the cheap ones, the ones that are around 100, 150, or 80 dollars, because they do not provide a good, accurate measurement. It deviates perhaps 2, 3, or 4 degrees. And for this purpose application of determining the stress of water for plants and the level of water to be applied, it's not good. The error will be large. So the more, the ones that come with a good calibration, they are more accurate. They are about $500 to $700. But they are very good in terms of estimating this stress level. We have a picture here of a pivot and with different colors showing a calculation of the stress, but this is with a camera, thermal camera that has a good spatial precision. You know, it has to have several pixels per plant to be accurate, avoiding getting the average of the pixels for the soil background. There is another picture here showing thermal cameras. On the right is a RGB picture. You have furrows, water are being applied, and the picture to the right is the derivation of the thermal band temperature data. And you see, the darker the color is, the cooler is, is the surface. And so when there is a lack of water, the plant is not transpiring at its potential, it warms up, it heats up, and that's what the sensor captures. So by tracking the difference of this DT, the difference in temperature of the canopy, the plant temperature with the air, so above it needs to be another sensor registering the air temperature at 2 to 3 meters above the canopy, or about 6 to 7 feet above the canopy, and also relative humidity is very important for this method. Air temperature, relative humidity, and the canopy temperature. And so it's scaling that DT between a maximum expected DT and a minimum expected DT for that crop. And these are functions, the DT max and DT min are functions for every crop. We'll show some numbers there, and they're being published in several studies, and those are known. But once you calculate your stress index using that temperature from the infrared thermometer, you can estimate the actual evapotranspiration of that surface, that crop. Of course, before we need to go through an intermediate step, and it's using that crop coefficient that we talk about through the FAO 56 approach, or the one that is implemented in WISE, the WISE tool. And then you get what it is, the actual water use. This is just showing different functions for the non-stress, the minimum difference in temperature expected. This is for corn. I'm showing some equations for Maricopa in Arizona and for Colorado, 2 different locations here, Akron and Iliff. We have for other locations as well. And the coefficients do not change much, but they do change depending on the variety of the crop, the agronomics. So there's a little bit of change there. So it's better to have these equations as much as possible locally or regionally developed. In this graph, this is one method applied here, one function, and established that this index is 0.56 or 56% of water stress of that crop. So that's typically a value of a crop that has not been irrigated properly. Otherwise, maximum it should be, in terms of this corn, maximum around 0.15, 0.2, and then needs to be irrigated back to decrease to 0 the stress to avoid yield losses. But if you have this type of calculations determining that the stress is 0.5, 0.6, then for sure you're going to suffer, or the crop's going to suffer yield loss. And there is a relationship between that stress index calculated measure and the soil water content. You see here, the less water content, in this case, volumetric water content in percentage there is in the soil, the larger the stress index. And this is for this particular type of soil near Iliff, silty clay loam soil, so it depends on the texture, of course. But there are those relationships that helps you relate based on your water stress from your infrared thermometer, how much water you need to apply. In this case, when we say that we need to irrigate around 0.15 to 0.2 of the stress index, that brings us to volumetric water content about 27 to 28%, will translate to a water application depth of about 2.75 inches. For this particular MAD of 55%, and it's more typical for surface irrigation or a sprinkler irrigation, not so much for center pivot, which needs to have a MAD of about half of that, so 20%, 25%. This is very busy, just to show some calculations for the crop stress index for a given condition, with the crop temperature was 84 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air temperature was 89.6 Fahrenheit, and the relative humidity 25.5. According to the crop coefficient approach, the plant should be at that growth stage evapotranspiring about 32 hundredths of an inch during that day. So doing the math here, we calculated this trending index to be 0.09 or 9%. So that means that there is no need to irrigate at the moment, but be ready for 1 or 2 days. This crop's gonna reach the 0.15 to 1.2. And you calculate the actual evapotranspirations to document water use in that day was 0.3 of an inch. That's one way of tracking water use and stress. Now, we know that the crop coefficient approach is not perfect because may not capture well the deficits of water. This is another approach where the crop coefficients are updated through reflectance, using remote sensing. And on the lower right corner, we have different sources of reflectance. These equations that are shown in here for vegetation indices based on reflectance were developed with ground-based radiometers, but those similar radiometers are mounted on drones or UAVs, microsatellites now that we have constellations, more and more microsatellites being launched, and typical larger satellite images that are free. So getting reflectance in the red and infrared bands, we calculate vegetation indices like the NDVI, get, for example, in this case, fractional cover, this FC, and estimate the crop coefficient. So it's very responsive to lack of nutrients, let's say nitrogen and water, and updates that crop coefficient. And by getting the AT reference, in this case, grass, we can map the actual transpiration. That's one limitation of this approach, reflectance-based, doesn't have the thermal band up in here, so doesn't capture the evaporation from the soil or the canopy surface after an irrigation, so it's mainly transpiration. And there are, again, different equations for the crop coefficients based on that reflectance or vegetation index using reflectance values. But nowadays is getting more adopted, this method. This is one case in California. I'm showing a map of this transpiration as a function of reflectance. What you see in the lower corner, there is an evapotranspiration. When you say CB is basal, that means this transpiration, the rate is in inches there. Okay, so there are other methods that are more complicated to get evapotranspiration, a larger scale using satellites, energy balance, one source and two source. It is more complicated, but these have been implemented recently through a platform in Google Earth Engine. There is a consortium of public and private entities that came up implementing this, bringing the energy balance and the crop coefficient, reflective crop coefficient in this so-called OpenET mapping of crop water use with a very good accuracy. Now they have available data for free, so they can promote this product for the public. I think you can go back 3 years, I think, and download monthly reports for different areas of interest for free. But they will also offer daily mapping of evapotranspiration for a small fee. And if we have time, I wanted to show some information on this tool online. Do we have time?
I think you have about 5 minutes. So
Yes.
yeah,
The video is 4 minutes, I believe, so that will
Okay.
work. Thank you.
okay. Yeah, and if folks have questions, you can type that into the chat right now, but it's pretty quiet, Jose.
Recent droughts have shown us how vulnerable those water supplies are and how difficult it is to really make sure that we can maintain.
It's still sounding pretty quiet on my end.
Sorry. Water on a daily basis. You need to give them the power and information to make those decisions.
As we try to balance the water resources in terms of not consuming more than what's coming into these aquifer systems, we have to understand how much water use we currently have.
One of the biggest challenges in water management has been access to cost-effective, easily usable information on evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration is the combination of evaporation from the land surface and transpiration from plants. For most crops, evapotranspiration is a key measure of the amount of water that needs to be replaced through irrigation or precipitation to ensure a well-watered, healthy crop with maximum yields.
It is one of those most critical variables for decision-making for water management and has until now been really difficult to attain. That's where OpenET comes in. OpenET fills a huge data gap for water management and makes evapotranspiration data widely accessible via an online platform for all states across the Western US.
We know we're going to have to use significantly less water. So agriculture has to figure out how to get as much per drop of water as they can. I go online and I can pull up the evapotranspiration numbers. So if I put on more water than evapotranspiration already have in my bank, I can shut off for a couple of days, which means a lot if you're putting out several million gallons of water a day.
OpenET provides an opportunity to get more relevant data, real-time data. It's really the bird's eye view of what's actually going on the ground. Evapotranspiration is happening all around us all the time, but because water returns to the atmosphere as water vapor, it's invisible and we can't see it. Satellites give us the ability to monitor evapotranspiration consistently across very large regions using thermal, infrared, and optical sensors.
OpenET is really revolutionary since that for the first time we're able to map water use at the field scale, where previously it was just not feasible.
Water to our operation means everything. With OpenET, it completely changes our ability to understand what's going on within our fields. The more that we have the science and the data, the more that we'll be able to make good decisions.
ET is the real amount of water that is being used by the vineyard. The ET data in some cases will help us detect over irrigation. In other cases, it's going to help us to distribute better that water along the season because we are able to track the stress.
With increasing temperatures, we're having increasing variability of droughts. We also are having longer fire seasons. And so when we begin our forest thinning projects, the trees will become more drought tolerant. OpenET will help us have data to inform how our forests are reacting to those climate change impacts that we're seeing.
We're beginning to see that we are all in this together. We need to understand the system better to make better management decisions in a more diverse society that takes into account the needs of a lot broader water community.
Making this ET data available to everyone so that we're all looking at the same information is transformative for water management in the West.
These are challenging and unprecedented times. We need bold new initiatives like OpenET to solve our water resources problems.
It's imperative that we put solutions in folks' hands so that we can continue to enjoy the food that is produced by agriculture across the West and make sure that we have enough water for the people and wildlife that depend on that critical resource.
Okay, so thanks for listening to that. And with that,
here is my contact information. I'll be happy to respond if you have questions and give more information on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. Really appreciate that. And yes, round of applause. Thank you, Retta. So thank you. And we'll type in your contact information in the chat there so folks can reach out to you to learn more if they would like to. And now I'm going to hand it over to Gus to take it away.
Excellent, and thank you again, Jose. That was a wonderful presentation. And with that, I'm very excited to introduce Ron Meyer, one of our extension colleagues who's out of the northeast area of Colorado. Ron holds 3 degrees in agriculture, 1 from Bismarck State College and 2 from North Dakota State University. Ron has been employed by North Dakota State University and currently is an agronomist with Colorado State University, located in Burlington, Colorado. So we really appreciate you being with us today, Ron. And with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Gus. I can see you. Can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up. All right, got that. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Gus, I can see you. Give me a thumbs up if the screen's good. Great. Hey, we'll move forward then. So I'm going to talk about dryland soil water management today. And well, first of all, I needed to get myself acclimated about what kind of rainfall you get, because it's all about capturing the water in dryland. And so I looked up at Cortez. This is monthly precipitation data. Cortez gets just under 13 inches of precip per year. The other thing I look for are patterns. So I had to ask, when do you guys get your moisture? The answer is pretty much after June, and you start to accumulate July, August, September. Out in the Eastern Plains, we're exactly the opposite. We get most of ours starting in March, and our fall and winter months are usually pretty dry. So this was interesting to me. So then I moved on to Dove Creek. Dove Creek just gets right under 15 inches per year. And again, the pattern's the same. Most of it starts accumulating after June. And so in the fall of the year is when you get most of that precip. And then I moved on over to Ignatia. Ignacio gets about just under 17 inches per year. And again, the pattern's the same. You guys get most of your precip after June. And so that's important. First thing is, when do you get it and how much do you get? And then the next thing we're going to address is how do you capture that? And so there are a couple of strategies I'll talk about today. So there are really 2 great ways to capture moisture in agriculture: tillage strategies, and then the other one is cropping systems. And so tillage strategies, you got some options in there: conventional tillage, reduced tillage, and then no-till. And I want to explain the difference as we go through this. There's a difference between no-till and never-till. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then as far as cropping systems, there are decisions to make, what crop to plant, and then the sequence, so the rotation. Now, both of these strategies, you have to have some flexibility built into those. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I tell folks, if there was one best crop to raise and one best herbicide to raise, we'd have 2 decisions to make, the crop and the herbicide. Fact of the matter is, Mother Nature is always one step ahead of us. And so lots of times things change out there in agriculture. We'll talk about that. I'll start with crops. I'm most comfortable as a cropping systems person. And so, within those rotations, there are some decisions to make. You grow wheat out there, safflower. Gus told me there's dry beans out there as well. Fallow is in the dryland rotation. Feed could be an option. And then other crops, I've got a question mark. I know you have grown sunflowers out there some years, and there are some other crops as well. And then the other consideration is, what kind of weed pressure are you going to get, and how do you manage that? So again, we'll work ourselves through these questions. So cropping strategies, out in the high plains on the eastern side, we like a 3-crop in 4-year rotation when we get the moisture. When we don't get the moisture, then we go with 2 crops in 3 years. And so our favorite rotation out here is wheat, then a spring planted crop, and then we'll fallow. Now, if we go into that fallow season with a full profile of soil moisture, we can add an opportunity crop into that, and we sometimes do. But for the most part, this picture shows a failed wheat crop. So we talked about flexibility. Whatever plan you take on, add some flexibility into that. So you can see the rotation here is wheat, then corn, then fallow, and then back to wheat. Now his wheat crop failed, and you can see the corn stubble from 2 years before that. But essentially this wheat crop got froze out, and so he had another decision to make. Do you fallow again for the second year, or do you put a crop in there? And so I get questions about, well, should I plant? So my question back is, can you get germination to occur? If the answer is yes, then planting could be an option. The next question I have is, how much soil moisture do you have built up? And it takes about 2 feet of soil profile to really help, because 2 feet of soil profile, if it's saturated, it's about 4 inches. Lots of times it's 3 inches. And so 3 inches will get that crop established in the spring of the year. And it gives you about a month to pick up some more precipitation. And that's going to be needed, because 3 inches of stored soil profile is not near enough to make a crop. But anyway, he actually killed this failed wheat crop down with some glyphosate and decided to plant into that, got a stand, and got some moisture, picked up some moisture the rest of the season. But you can see his tillage strategy. You know, in the fallow year, he doesn't do much to destroy that residue, because he's still got corn residue from 2 seasons ago. And so that has helped tremendously, because it's all about capturing the moisture you get on dry land. Now, there are some other spring crop strategies. Safflower can work for you guys. Dry beans, sunflower, feed could be an option. Corn and milo also could be options. The bottom line is, whatever you're planting, plant a drought tolerant crop. That'll give you the opportunity to put your best cropping system strategy put forward. So, you know, as far as corn, there are drought genes now for corn. We use a lot of drought genes out here in our dry land. Milo, sunflowers, safflower are very drought and heat tolerant. Dry beans are also pretty tough. They're just not deep rooted, but can survive. So keep in mind, whatever crop you use, you know, pick a drought tolerant one. And with drought tolerance, also oftentimes comes heat tolerance. And then we tend to leave our stubble standing over the winter. So we talked about tillage strategies. We do a lot of reduced tillage out here. So we'll, in our wheat crop, we sometimes will till in front of that wheat crop. And the reason is, we use a lot of hoe drills out here, and those hoe drills just don't tend to handle residue very easily. Now, there are some disc drills here that handle residue a lot better. And absolute no-tillers will use disc drills to plant wheat, but for the most part, we're reduced tillage out here. So we till in front of our wheat plant and plant wheat into that, and then we tend not to till much anymore after that. So we'll leave the wheat stubble grow leave it over the winter time. If we have weeds growing, then we knock those down with herbicides in the fall of the year, and then we tend to plant our row crops, the spring planted crop, into that standing wheat stubble. And then after the row crop comes off in the fall of the year, we tend to let that stand over the summer, winter and summer. Now, though, when we do till, it's about midsummer and later. And then we're anticipating hoe drills going back into that wheat crop. Some of the disc drill folks won't till much at all. So that's kind of the strategy and the rotation and tillage strategies we tend to use. Now, we grow a lot of grasses out here. We're wheat, corn, milo. A grass broadleaf fallow rotation would be much healthier. And so we will put sunflowers into that rotation once in a while. You also grow dryland dry beans out there, which is a broadleaf as well. That's a much better rotation versus grass on grass. And so there's a researcher, Petalcow, in the literature search. He reported a 2.5 bushel increase in soybeans in a 4-year rotation. So that's corn and soybean rotation. He also reported a bump in corn yield as a result of having the soybeans in that rotation as well. Hansen did some research in Colorado and reported a wheat corn fallow rotation resulted in 20 to 40% increases in net farm income versus a wheat fallow system out here on the eastern side. Now, 20 to 40%, that's a wide range, but really net farm income depends on a couple of things: the rainfall you get during the season and the price of the crop. And so that explains the wide variations in net farm income in those rotations. And he worked out here for about 10 years or so. So, you know, our forefathers didn't have very many tools. Tillage was the weed control tool they used, the seed bed preparation strategy they used, and the erosion control strategy they had. So this guy's out here trying to save his ground from blowing away, and there's no question why it's blowing away. It's just bare out there. So we average 9 miles per hour per day for wind. We have wind towers out here for a reason. They're harvesting that wind. So I tell folks, you know, the days it doesn't blow, the next day it can blow 18 miles an hour because it's got to maintain that average. We have a lot of wind out here. Well, today we've got much better tools. We've got herbicides that will work with reduced tillage and no tillage. We've got equipment that can work its way through that heavy residue. And so we've just got a lot better residue management techniques today. You can see this picture. We've got corn that was planted into wheat stubble, and that's all been harvested. They're going to leave this over the winter, and there's just it reduces the opportunities for wind and water erosion in this kind of a scenario. So tillage strategies: conventional tillage, reduced tillage, no-till are all tools out there. Conventional tillage, well, some guys out here that still do that. Some of the smaller farmers, they just till every year. And there's a couple of reasons for that. You know, they've got the tillage equipment, and then there are different costs associated with using herbicides in lieu of tillage. Reduced tillage, that's the strategy we use most out here, and that's you till when necessary. So there are weed issues and planting accommodations that will dictate when to till, and you know, the wetter seasons, we tend to get more weed issues here. And then, you know, there's some people that just don't have the right planting equipment to get through the heavy residue. And so that also forces some tillage. And then there's no till. So there's never till versus flexible. We do have some no-tillers out here that had plans never to till, and a shift in the weed pressure forced them to actually hook up to an old piece of tillage equipment that has been parked in the trees for a long time and go out and attack that. So I'll give you some examples. You know, we grow corn, a lot of corn out here. It's Roundup Ready, glyphosate resistant corn. And so that was our product of choice. And 20 years ago, that's the only herbicide we needed because it worked on everything. Today, we can't kill kochia or Palmer amaranth with glyphosate because there were resistant genes in the gene pool. And when you're using one product only, you're selecting for the resistant pests, essentially. So it's good to be flexible. And so when things change out there in the real world, you've got to adapt to that and make a change yourself. So we'll stay with tillage strategies. There are advantages and disadvantages of no-till. Some of the benefits to reduced tillage, we have decreased soil erosion. So that's both wind and water erosion. Reduced soil compaction, reduced time for field activities because it takes longer to disc a field than it does to spray a field. This is some old data regarding fuel costs. That researcher reported a $4 per acre field fuel cost. It's easily triple today. And then reduced soil water losses. And so that's the important one, because to a dryland farmer, any inch you capture is money in the bank. And then there are healthier soils associated with reduced tillage. So organic matter levels and soil carbon levels are two of the big ones that we deal with out here. And so I'll give you an example. You know, anytime you deal with soils, the changes are slow. So when we switched from conventional till and compared that to no-till, the organic matter levels increased every year, but over a 10-year period, it was about 1%. So soil changes are slow to come. They move in the right direction, but that's only about 0.1% better per year. But that's important. The other piece to that is soil carbon levels, and we can now get paid for soil carbon credits. And so keep that in mind. Reduced tillage increases soil carbon, and that could be a check to you for capturing that. So there are disadvantages to no-till and reduced-till equipment. There are, some of our hoe drills just will not handle high residue loads, and so we're planting wheat into that system and getting poor stands. So that's one of the reasons we till in front of wheat is some of the hoe drills just won't handle the residue. And then herbicide costs are increased. So, that's a trade-off with fuel costs, but keep in mind, if you've got the right weed out there, it's not hard to spend $20 an acre trying to control it with chemistry only. So herbicide costs are increased, and that's an increased cost when you reduce your tillage. All right, just some statistics. In 1990, 6% of the U.S. farmland was no-till. In 2016, 35% of the U.S. farmland was no-till. USDA reported from 1982 to 2003, they reported a reduction in soil erosion of about 43%, due mostly to reduced tillage levels. And then Hansen, who was a Colorado researcher, did some work with slopes. Now we're pretty flat out here, but he found that on a 4% slope, field averaged 0.3 of an inch of water runoff per year with residue management. That same 4% slope averaged 3 inches of water runoff year with no residue management. And so again, that extra 3 inches of water is money in the bank to a dry land farmer. This is from Bowder et al. He did some work in Northeast Colorado, and he was looking at soil health and water quality, and he looked at conventional till, which compared it to strip till, and you can see the water runoff. Number one, he's getting water leaving the field with conventional tillage. It's also carrying a pretty big soil load with it too. Now, not only is soil leaving this field with this water, phosphorus levels, nitrogen levels, and maybe some micronutrients are also leaving. With the strip tillage, that amount of water was actually infiltrating into the soil. And as a result, yields were higher with the strip tillage versus his conventional tillage. So Hansen, Colorado researcher, reported a 25% decrease in soil erosion due to reduced tillage. Peterson, another Colorado researcher, reported water storage losses of 80% when no residue was left on the soil surface. Now, these were evaporation losses. So water wasn't running off the field, it was evaporating out of the field because of residue that wasn't there. So during the summertime period, especially in our fallow period, but we get 95 degrees Fahrenheit air temperatures with that 9 mile per hour average wind speed, and our evaporation losses are pretty tremendous some years. So Peterson also reported soil water storage efficiencies increased using minimal tillage, so that's strategic tillage. So what Gary Peterson did was we were tilling right in front of wheat planting and then not tilling all the rest of the rotations. So following wheat harvest, we use herbicides to control weeds and then plant that spring crop into wheat stubble. We leave the standing stubble over the winter, and Peterson found that resulted in an extra 3 inches of water captured in the soil during that rotation period. So tillage, these researchers found tillage can cost 1/4 of an inch of water per pass. And they also found that at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is midsummer for us, with wind, the water loss can be as high as 1/2 inch per pass. Some other researchers reported carbon dioxide losses in plowing they were 400 pounds per acre. And in no-till, there were still CO2 losses, but only about 5 pounds per acre. So carbon dioxide losses contain carbon. And so they were essentially losing carbon from their soils due to tillage. So we've got much better tools today. This just shows a field of sunflowers planted into standing wheat stubble. And you can see there's a lot of stubble in here, but you know, with the planters we have today, you've got trash whippers in front, you've got down pressure adjustments, getting seed to penetrate into the soil 2 inches is very doable with today's equipment. This just shows you another planter unit, and I want to call your attention to the yellow hydraulic shafts that are attached to each unit. So this is a no-till drill, and the biggest problem we have in no-till and reduced till is getting penetration into some of our hard soils, especially if it has lots of residue on it and is dry. So we have silt loam soils here that in dry conditions, they can get pretty tough. And this particular drill, you just adjust the downward pressure to get seed penetration. I've got a little 6-foot Great Plains drill with disc openers, and I don't have these yellow adjustments on mine. So what I had to do was just add some weight. So I added 400 pounds of weight to that drill, and I penetrate hard soils much easier. So there are adjustments you can make to drills that aren't set up for no-till specifically that can work very well. Another adjustment that I haven't made on mine because I haven't needed is seed firmers in the back and then discs up front to cut the residue. So keep in mind, weeds are an issue regarding no-till especially, and we're substituting spraying for tillage. Herbicide costs will be increased. And it becomes especially difficult if you've got a tillage tool setting in the yard and now you're buying a sprayer. So we've had, for the most part, we've had guys make that adjustment out here. One guy did share with me, though, he sold every tillage piece of equipment he had on the farm, so he wasn't tempted to hook up to it. And he's actually getting along pretty well. So, you know, I talked about Mother Nature being one step ahead of us. This is Roundup resistant, glyphosate resistant kochia. And you can see all the weeds are controlled in this field except the glyphosate resistant kochia. And what happened is those resistant plants, some other plants rolled across the field. We get kochia trails. This has become quite common in the high plains now. So the strategy of post-emergent applications to control kochia, we had to set aside. We now control this glyphosate resistant kochia with pre-emerge products, and Spartan is one of our favorites, but there are ways around that. You just have to plan for it. Okay, on the left-hand side, we've got conventional tillage. On the right-hand side, we've got reduced tillage, and you can see there's some crusting issues going on the left-hand side. Right-hand side, a lot less runoff potential as well. This crop has actually emerged, so crusting is not an issue with this, but water runoff could be. This just shows the water loss from different operations. One-way disc, chisel can, you know, after 4 days, you can lose up to a ½ inch of moisture. Sweep plow, where you're leaving the residue up on top. Remember, our losses are mostly evaporative. So where you're leaving residue on top, the water loss is a lot less. Percent residue lost after using different equipment. Spraying, you don't lose any residue. Sweeps leave residue on top, so about 10% loss per pass. If you take a look down at the moldboard plow, 90 to 100% of the residue lost after each operation shouldn't surprise us. As you know, that's a pretty aggressive tillage. But the one thing I want to show you is on the bottom of this chart, the overwinter weathering losses to residue can be 15 to 25%. So Mother Nature and its heat and water dependent will reduce the residue by itself. Now we need that to happen because as that residue gets degraded, it turns into organic matter and carbon levels. And so that's important. But the other piece to that is it's water driven essentially. As we move east into Kansas where they get more rainfall, that overwintering weather loss starts at 30%. So again, even if you do nothing, that residue will naturally degrade, and we need that to happen. All right, no-till acres over time. This just shows that starting from about 1982 to 2016, we're tilling a lot less in this country, and it's a direct result of the better equipment and herbicides we have. So the picture on the left is full tillage, and that's pretty easy to manage. You hook up to an implement, and when you get weeds or you need to prepare a seed bed, you just till. The picture on the right-hand side, there's just a little bit more management. So you're not tilling to control weeds, you're selecting the right herbicide now to control those weeds. All right. Gus also said you had Canada thistle and field bindweed, and so I just thought I'd address that briefly. There are products out there you can manage that with, Curtail, Stinger. Keep in mind now, some of these, and these two of them, will carry over to the next year. So there are products that you use, if they're carrying over, you have to know that because they could affect the next crop. Glyphosate is also another product for Canada thistle. It works okay, not great, but with glyphosate, there's no carryover. And then dicamba. We've had actually good luck with dicamba. It's an old herbicide, it's been around a while, a pint per acre in the fall after the first frost, because after that first frost, carbohydrates are moving down to the roots, it'll take the dicamba with it. And so Canada thistle can be controlled that way. Field bindweed seems to be another weed you have. We have it out here as well. 2,4-D ester in the spring will burn it down, but it will not control it. Dicamba late in the season with an adjuvant will burn it as well. There's one called Facet. It's got carryover, so you got to plant your wheat deeper than 1 inch when you're using some of these products. Glyphosate can also work too, but it doesn't work very well. So with field bindweed, those seeds can last 40 years or longer. I tell folks, and Canada thistle is similar. These are long, if you've got these weeds, these are long-term weeds that you've got to plan for every year, because you can knock down mother plants, but you're going to get seed production, producing new plants in the future. So you know where those spots are and just treat them accordingly. Grasses, glyphosate still works really well in grasses, and so we control our annual grasses and some perennials with glyphosate nicely. All right, I'll summarize here and then I'll be done. So capture the water that you do get. Use cropping systems to maximize those opportunities. You got to be flexible because things change out there. Use drought tolerant and heat tolerant crops. Reduce tillage trips when you can, and allow that crop stubble to remain over the winter, regardless of which crop you're growing. So with that, I think I'm all done. Yes. I'm going to stop sharing and move on. Gus, I'm back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ron. That was wonderful information. Unfortunately, we are under a little bit of a time crunch, so we don't have time for questions at this point. Hopefully, we'll have some time a little bit later in the program to ask our presenters some questions. If Ron's not able to be around at that point, I can put everybody in touch with him. We'll make sure your questions are answered. But once again, terrific information. With that, our next speaker will be Dr. Joe Brummer, another one of us CSU folks. And thank you, Joe, for being here with us today. Joe has worked for Colorado State University since 1994. First at the Mountain Meadow Research Center in Gunnison for 12 years, conducting research and extension programs in the area of high elevation forage and livestock production. He then moved to the main campus in Fort Collins in 2006, where he currently has a statewide responsibility in the area of forage production and management. So with that, Joe, thanks again for being here with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Gus. I'll go ahead and see if we can share my screen here. There we go. All right, so yeah, it's great to be with you today. I'm the forage specialist, so Emily asked me to talk a little bit more on the areas of forage type crops, and alfalfa is one of the big ones. So I'll spend the most time talking about alfalfa, and then maybe talk a little bit about some grass crops, and then maybe just do a little quick comparison to water use and timing of water use with some of our grain crops and how that differs from the forages. So first, I thought I'd give just a little bit of background on alfalfa in general, some things that maybe some people don't really realize. It kind of gets a bad name for its water use out there, but when you look at the history of alfalfa and where it came from, it comes from a very dry part of the world. You know, Iran, the Caucasus Mountains, that kind of that Asia Minor, you know, it dates back over 6,000 years. So it evolved in a very dry part of the world. So it's actually a very drought tolerant plant. And anybody that's grown alfalfa knows about the autotoxicity issue, and you can't plant alfalfa on alfalfa because it produces a toxin that, you know, keeps those little seedlings of alfalfa from coming up and establishing. So it really kind of gives that priority for those limited resources, and especially water, to those already established plants. But again, it's a really bad name these days for its high water use. It's a long season crop. We harvest it, you know, 3, 4, 5 times through the season. And so depending on where you're at in Colorado, it can, you know, take upwards of 36 plus inches of total water, or that ET that Jose was talking about. I just have this kind of generalized chart here, and it depends on where you're at in Colorado, but I kind of wanted to concentrate on the Southwest. Emily asked me to talk a little bit, and so I wanted to concentrate down in that area. So alfalfa, you know, these are just kind of averages. And so that ET, or consumptive use, we call it sometimes, you know, about 30 inches of total water. So that would be precip plus irrigation. But, you know, you go to places, dry places like Fruita, the Arkansas Valley around Rocky Ford, you know, 36, 38 inches of water is what you're going to require to grow full alfalfa crop. So it's been a number of years ago now, but Dr. Neil Hansen and I had a graduate student working on some alfalfa and limited irrigation of alfalfa that I'll talk about some of his results here in just a minute. But we sent him to the literature and pulled out all these articles, and we put all this data together. And so these are data from, you know, Montana and New Mexico and Wisconsin. But when you, and it's quite variable, as you can see from all the dots there, but when you draw a regression line through there and do the calculations, it takes about, you know, 5.5 or just a little over inches of water per ton of alfalfa produced. So again, just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. So here's, again, another thing we need to, again, we harvest it, it grows all season long, starts early in the spring, it's a cool season crop. And so the water use efficiency, when, you know, we get the most pounds of dry matter forage produced per inch of water applied, is in that first and last cutting of the season during the cooler parts of the year. I just drew these little arrows on here for a 1 ton yield. And for that first and fourth cutting, you know, we're taking, you know, maybe 3, 3.25 inches of water to produce that ton. But on that second and third cutting during the middle part of the summer, we're up over 6 inches per ton. So again, just showing something to think about when you're trying to maximize your irrigation water use and efficiency of that irrigation water. You know, early and late cuttings are a lot more water use efficient than the summer ones. So when you start kind of thinking about that, there's different, maybe a couple of different options for how to kind of maybe spread your limited water out when you're trying to grow alfalfa. One is what we call limited irrigation, basically where you water it all season long, but at a reduced rate. You're not meeting full ET. So you're going to see a reduced yield. So you kind of try to baby it along through the whole season. What we've kind of settled on in a lot of our research is what we call a seasonal deficit or a partial season irrigation, where you fully irrigate it, again, trying to maybe hit those times of the year where it's more water use efficient. So that springtime would be one of the ideal times. Then we limit or totally withhold the water during those hotter parts of the year. So that, again, this can really improve our overall water use efficiency. And I'll show you some data here in just a minute, but we've seen very few long-term impacts to the actual alfalfa stand. And we've really stressed it, and you'll see that in some of the pictures, but so we can save some water while still getting at least a partial crop of, that you can either sell or feed to your own animals. So here's some, I didn't have time to show you all the data, but this is 1 year of data. We did this down here at Berthoud along the Front Range with the Northern Water Conservancy District, showing the treatments we first initially tried was full irrigation. That was our control. And then we watered it fully through the second cutting, then totally cut the water off, let it go kind of semi-dormant. We did a spring and fall irrigation where we fully watered it through the first cutting, cut it off for second and third. And then after the third cutting, we started putting water back on it. And again, trying to hit that first and fourth cutting that have that higher water use efficiency. And then one really severe treatment where we just water it through that first cutting and then totally cut it off. And then all it gets for the rest of the season is what's stored in the soil or what Mother Nature gives it. So the fully irrigated 24 inches of irrigation, about half that for that stop after second, and that spring and fall irrigation, and only 3.6 inches for that stop after first. And then you can see how the total yields went from 8.2 tons fully irrigated down to 3.6 tons for that stop after first. But again, we harvested all 4 cuttings, but when you get down to that stop after first, 3/10, 2/10 of a ton per acre, that's not going to be economical for a producer to actually harvest. So the next year in 2007, we went out and actually dug up and counted the crowns on a per square foot basis. What we actually found was most severe treatment actually had the most alfalfa plants alive and still growing. This spring and fall treatment, again, we thought that one was really going to work for us, trying to capitalize on that water use efficiency, that first and fourth cutting. But when you stress it during the middle part of the summer, it kind of goes dormant, semi-dormant, and then you put water back on it after that third harvest and try to wake it back up. And then it kind of goes into that winter in a depleted state. And so we actually saw the worst and the most significant winter kill or die off of the alfalfa plants with that particular treatment. So we kind of started to shy away from that one. The other thing that, when you do these partial season irrigations, and you're going to get something after you stop irrigating, there's stored soil moisture. Hopefully you get a little bit of input from Mother Nature. And so you can get, sometimes a small crop, even though you're not irrigating. And what typically happens when you stress a plant with water stress, you're going to get a higher quality. So less fiber, higher protein, those types of things. So here's the relative feed values. And I just circled the ones there for when we were actually seeing the water stress or applying the water stress to the plants. And you can basically see that we saw a higher relative feed value. And if you're selling the hay, even though you're not getting the tonnage, you can sometimes get a quality incentive if you're selling to dairy quality hay or that type of thing. So we took that Berthoud study and we went to the west slope and took what we thought were the couple of the best treatments. And in this situation, we're working over at the research center outside of Fruita there. And we had a fully irrigated treatment, a stop after second, and then a stop after first. We did that for 2 years in a row. And this was at the time of the third cutting there in August. And you can see this stop after second. It's stressed, it's kind of turning that bluish color, stunted growth. But again, over here where we stopped after first, very little regrowth. And I remember over here in 2014, Calvin Pearson was at the research center there, and he called me on the phone and he says, "Joe, I'm sorry to tell you, but I think your alfalfa's dead." And it's like, well, that's what we were here to try to find out. But when we looked at that, significant yield hits when we stopped irrigating after second, stopped irrigating after first. Again, we did that 2 years in a row. But what was kind of cool in this whole thing is in the third year, after 2 years of cutting the irrigation back, we fully irrigated those stands. And basically, the more severely we impacted or withheld the water, the better the stand bounced back. So that stop after first actually had the highest yields when we went back to full irrigation in 2015 there, with the stop after second being kind of intermediate to the one that we had irrigated fully throughout the whole study. So again, alfalfa is very resilient and can really bounce back. So again, we're continuing to work on this. We have some more studies that are continuing to go on, but some things to kind of think about. I think that, that stopping after second, if you have water or even through that time period, when you think about it, and there's been studies done on this, about 60% of your total yield comes in those first two cuttings in a 4-cut system, or about 75% of your total yield comes in those first two cuttings if you're in a 3-cut system. So, you can take those first two, you're likely going to get some regrowth from stored soil moisture, or you can either take it if you get enough to economically take it, you can harvest that as a 3rd cutting, or you can also graze that regrowth as well. If you don't have, very little water, that stop after first, you can really capitalize on that higher yield of that first cutting, capitalize on that higher water use efficiency. If you get anything after that, enough to cut, you can get those quality incentives, those types of things. But again, alfalfa tends to be, very resilient in what we've seen in our studies. Now I wanted to just talk briefly about perennial grasses, grass hay fields. And again, here's just some values: consumptive use, Cortez around 25 inches or so. And when you look at it and compare those grass hay fields versus alfalfa, perennial grasses are going to use about 10 to 15% less water compared to alfalfa. So again, just switching to grass as a hay crop can save you on your total water use in a given season, let alone if you need to cut back on your water. So this is just a graph that I put together for another presentation when I gave down in the San Luis Valley in Monte Vista. But again, kind of shows this idea of, your first cutting of grass, that's when you get the reproductive, the stems and the seed heads. That's going to be your biggest yielding, not your highest quality, but it's going to be your biggest yielding crop. So if you, and you'll generally take that in a cool season in mid to late June. So if you irrigate it fully through then, at Monte Vista, you'd be applying about 7 inches of water is what you would need. Again, then you can just let those go dormant, save all of this, June or July, August, when it's really high consumptive use, ET values, just let it go dormant. And then again, you've got a hay crop and you've taken the best crop, the highest yielding crop you can for the season. So again, if you're kind of into these limited irrigation, partial season irrigation situations, maybe you have early season water. This is some data from down in Farmington, looking at some different species of grass and applying increasing amounts of irrigation water. And as we know, a lot of the wheat grasses, so here we have intermediate wheatgrass here, and we have crested wheatgrass. So when we're down here with, again, more minimal water, those are drought tolerant species, and they're species that are able to produce some tonnage, again, with limited water. Things like meadow brome and orchard grass and some of those, they really respond well to water, but they don't do very well when you have limited water. I highlighted smooth brome here. It's this line here, this number 3. And I generally put that in dryland mixes. And it's very drought tolerant, but it doesn't produce really well when you have limited water. So again, even it's there, it'll stabilize the soil, but it's not all that productive. And when you get out here, again, you start to see that big separation in the species when you have plenty of water. Now I just wanted to, this is for Cortez, I wanted to show, again, kind of comparisons between the alfalfa and the grass hay. amounts of water. Again, these are just kind of calculated values. But Emily also wanted me to speak a little bit about some of the, maybe the annual type forages, like, barleys and maybe some of the warm season species. So again, these are for grain crops over here, but spring grains around 18 inches and very similar for winter wheat. We're not irrigating that during that winter time period. So very similar water use. And that would be taking it clear to full grain. Again, for the nice thing about forage is if you don't, we're just producing biomass. So you want to water it when you have the water available and take the biomass that you have. We don't have to get it to a fully mature state to get grain off of it. When you think about some of the annual type forages, we often go to the warm season species, things like millet, Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan. Those are all a lot more water use efficient. They're more drought tolerant. But if you're thinking about when you have water available, more often than not, in Colorado, we have maybe, if you're going to have any irrigation water, it's that early season water. And then plus you have stored soil moisture, hopefully coming off of that winter time period. So sometimes the warm seasons may not fit if you have some irrigation water available, and if that water is available in the early season. So oftentimes the cool seasons are the ones where you really want to maybe concentrate things like, the barleys and the oats, and, cereal rye is extremely drought tolerant, doesn't take a lot of water. Triticale, the cross between wheat and rye. Some of those might be a better option for you to take advantage of that stored soil moisture coming off of winter and maybe some limited water you'd have available during the runoff season. I just also wanted to point out with those annuals, couple of cautions here. Potential for nitrate poisoning that can happen in any species, both warm and cool seasons. The sorghums are known nitrate accumulators, especially if you put any nitrogen fertilizer on those and then the crop gets stunted or water stress. You can have very high nitrate concentrations. So be sure you test the hay before you feed it, because whatever's there when you cut it is what's going to be in the hay. It does not dissipate over time. And then the other one, again, if you're growing some of those warm seasons, anything in the sorghum genus, so that would be Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, or the forage sorghums, they can accumulate prussic acid. Primarily an issue under grazing because it does dissipate in hay and silage, but again, it's something that you might want to be aware of and test for if you think that there might be any kind of a problem along the way. But again, the nitrate is the one that I think you really need to pay attention to. Just to kind of wrap up here, Emily wanted me to say something a little bit about, again, the forages versus taking something to grain. Again, to me with forages, we're just trying to produce biomass. You put the water on it when you have it, and you take whatever biomass you can get if it's economical to harvest it or to graze it. But when you're talking about a grain crop, things kind of switch around a little bit, and we can stress those crops more in that vegetative stages of growth. And then as we get closer and closer to the reproductive stages, this is using corn as the example here. This would be close to tasseling here, pollination. Those are the time periods when we need, if you have water, when you need to put it on, or else you're going to see really significant yield reductions. So we can stress it early with, I'm not going to say you're not going to get any kind of yield reduction, but maybe a little more minimal yield reduction. And then the closer you get to reproduction and pollination is when you really need to apply that water back to those crops. And this holds for most of our grain type crops. I just pulled this. This is some data from Kansas for one of their research sites where, again, for corn, showing 1991, where they had a very severe drought. So with no irrigation, 3 bushels per acre. But when they were able to water it, here's just once, right at tasseling, 124 bushels to acre, watered it at tasseling, and 1 week after, 148 bushels, and then we're able to water it 3 times at tasseling, and 1 and 2 weeks after, 155 bushels. So again, just trying to illustrate that, at that reproductive stage is where it becomes really critical when we're talking about our grain crops. So to just wrap it up, for alfalfa, that partial season irrigation, I think, is a really good way to save some water while maintaining at least a partial hay crop. Our work has shown that, that stop after first and stop after second are viable options. I think the stop after second is a lower risk, but again, we've seen very good recovery in stand health and vigor by even with, just watering it through that first harvest and then letting it basically kind of go dormant, semi-dormant. For perennial grasses, again, we can do kind of that same thing, get that first, water it through that first harvest, but then I think we want to use some of those more drought tolerant species, the intermediate pubescent wheatgrass, some of those, and then just let it again go dormant during that high water use time period in July and August. For your annuals, I think, sometimes cool season ones might be better than the warm seasons. If you're totally dry land, the warm season ones are good to plant in that June time period and see what Mother Nature gives you. And then again, if you're thinking about grain crops and how those kind of compare back to these forage crops, again, you can stress it out early during the vegetative state. But again, you really need to concentrate your water, and hopefully you can have some water available closer to that reproductive stage, again, to really kind of minimize your impacts on your grain yields. So with that, I think that's what I have for you.
Excellent, Joe. Well, thank you very much for that presentation. That was just exactly the kind of information that we were after with this. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, I'm going to turn it back over to Emily to introduce our next speaker. And we did have some questions in the chat, and we'll definitely try to get to those here shortly and at the end of the presentation.
Oh, okay, awesome. Thanks, Joe. And yeah, some question there from one of my favorite Montezuma County producers, so no pressure. But so we are going to take this home with Simon Martinez. So thank you very much for being here. He is the general manager at the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Farm in Ranch Enterprise. It's a farm that consists of 110 center pivots. And so he's going to talk about what happened this year with that greatly reduced irrigation that we had this year. And he also is the manager of the Bow and Arrow brand there. So Simon, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Very interesting information already given. I'll try to add to what was already talked about. I'll spend a little bit of time, a few minutes on Ute Farm and Ranch, and it'll tie back into Bow and Arrow brand. We do farm on a good year over 7,600 acres on 110 pivots. Now, last year in 2021, we had a drought basically because there was no carryover in the McPhee Reservoir, which is about 39.9 miles from our location here in Southwest Colorado, within throwing distance to the Four Corners Monument. And it's all gravity flow, so it's a unique project if anybody hasn't been down in this area to view the farm that was put into place through an Indian Water Rights Settlement Act in 1987. And last year, we discovered with no carryover and 10% of our water, we were only going to get 2,500 acre feet of our usually projected 23,500, and then access to 2,000 to 4,000 leased water to finish off what we usually grew on a normal year of about 4,500 acres of alfalfa, a little over 2,000 acres of corn, and then we tie in a little over 1,000 acres of triticale and some grass for the Bow and Arrow herd, blackback baldy Angus herd. Right now they're in calving season. The drought has affected the farming project, and we're still in waiting to see what effect this drought will have on the cattle operation. Now, as we're going into 2022 this year, it looks the same as last year, or we're looking at maybe 2002. We had was in hope in December of 21, around 30% of our water allocation, but as of everybody sees in the weather reports, January and February were very dry here in the Southwest. So we are contemplating and looking at possibly a 10% water use again, and we'll know next week. The difference where we're at on our elevation at about a little over 5,000 is we're able to start watering at least 30 days prior to up north of Cortez. We start watering about April 1st while there's still snow on the ground north of Cortez. And we can water anything into 30 longer days into October on a full water allocation. Now this goes in and ties into effect with Bow and Arrow brand. Years back, we put in a facility that would do sweet corn, and we were able to produce sweet corn, the fancy, and our issue here was location. Trying to get the sweet corn to market, we needed anywhere from 3 to 5 semis a day, and not being by a rail and everything leaving by trucks, we found it a little difficult because of our location to stay in business, to get corn to the areas, if it be HEB, Whole Foods, whoever we were contracting with, to get it there within a 3-day period. So we knew that wasn't going to work because of our location. So the facility was in place, and then we added another portion. Weemanooch Construction Authority out of Toyoak built a facility where we were able to put in a state-of-the-art corn mill facility in 2014. And tying back into the farm, it affects our planting. Every year, we had no intentions to go to a water allocation worksheet. We've always used how many fields of alfalfa, and all of it was dairy. 80–90% of it would go into the Comanche, Texas area. So the alfalfa, we had proven with a good customer base that we could provide a very high quality alfalfa for dairy product. And the acres, we have a 500,000 bushel capacity grain storage facility. And through the years of having our normal water usage through the Indian Water Rights Settlement Act, all 110 pivots usually would run. And we would operate with, like I said, 4,500 acres of alfalfa, 2,000 of corn, and we'd have acreage for the cattle. On the Bow and Arrow herd, the cattle, they winter here through the winter months, and then they go up to the high country in the summer months on rangeland that we've procured through the years. What this drought has done is it's really identified to, we know where the money is in the alfalfa, but then the employment that we've been able to produce at Bow and Arrow brand, 8 to 12 employees, 80% of them are tribal members. They've learned to mill, they've learned every aspect of the mill itself when it was put in 2014. And the decision had to be made. Well, last year with 10% water, we got a single cutting on 1,200 acres of alfalfa. So tying into this drought, which we're all seeing, it's looks like it's going to carry through 2022 if nothing changes, and how it ties into employment for people at Bow and Arrow. So we've concentrated our efforts back on the 10% of water to the corn for the corn mill facility. Now it's all non-GMO certified. We keep the gluten, whole grain, kosher, and level 2 SQF. And there's a lot of certifications that have been gone into the value added product. And when we got away from the GMO and went to non-GMO corn years back, to keep that certification so we don't grow any GMO, we stay right with the non-GMO certified corn. And we've made the decision to stay with yellow corn, white corn, and blue. Now we tried some Indian blend corn in the market, didn't seem to go too far. We were in the beginning when this facility was built, we went in with a clipper cleaner and decided to do just whole corn and clean it up to 5 grams or less on whole corn at the time. What this has allowed us to do moving forward through this drought in the last 3 to 4 years is move more to a value added milled product. So as we've progressed at the mill, Ute Farm and Ranch is able to grow what corn is needed for the use of bow and arrow. And that corn, we do not do much whole corn anymore. We will, but it's a very tight market. And we've been able to utilize our mill a lot better with milled corn in different granulations to different customer base, to California, to Delaware, up in the Minnesota's area, and throughout the Denver, Phoenix, Albuquerque, for different needs. If it's white corn for Pasoli, or yellow corn for Zia Taqueria in Durango that makes the tortilla chips, or Rockalitas in Denver that are now doing different types of tortilla chips at the Pepsi Center, or they're interested now and they're doing a blue guana chip that we've been working with them on. So what I've noticed here through the last few years, this drought starting in 21 with no carryover, and the second largest man-made reservoir in Colorado, which is the McPhee Reservoir, we've got a decision to make on how we choose our crops. And you know, corn does use a little less than alfalfa. We were approached to get back into the sunflower business, which we used to do years ago, and it uses even less water. Now it comes down to the point of a drought. Do we produce sunflower because it uses less water? Then in return, it affects employment at the mill. Or do we stay with a little bit of corn with what water allocation we have and go with one cutting? Our hope this year was about a 33% water allocation to water up 12 to 1,500 acres of alfalfa full cuttings. Now it looks like we might be back down to 12 to 1,500 acres of alfalfa one cutting. We've got 650 cow-calf on the project. Is there going to be feed for those cattle coming back in the fall? If we decide and move forward with importing any corn, you just don't go to your neighbor and find any non-GMO yellow, blue, or white corn. You know, Illinois, maybe some in Texas. And I think my position here for the tribe is employment, and will continue as long as I can to employ people, not only tribal members, but other, which is a native base if it's Navajo or other, and then non-native. And we have all three employed at Ute Farm and Ranch and at Bow and Arrow. This drought has affected employment at Farm and Ranch, probably 50%. And Bow and Arrow has stayed steady with 8 to 12 employees, and the customer base has grown. So we have to be very careful, because now we're in a position that Bow and Arrow pays the bills to Farm and Ranch because of the corn that is stored and grown and harvested at Farm and Ranch is now a product that Bow and Arrow uses, and in return, Bow and Arrow pays Farm and Ranch for the corn, so it's revenue for Farm and Ranch. So it's important to us now that we really concentrate on our customer base. Now that the amount of water that we're going to get this year may be the same as last year, we'll know next week. And our cropping plan consists of what water we get, 39.9 miles from McPhee Reservoir, which 90% comes off the Dolores River. So in our certifications at the mill have to stay in place, which are very expensive. And like I've said, we've gone a lot more to pneumatic trucks at the mill. So a lot of our customers come in and are taking pneumatic truckloads of whole corn, of cracked corn, or some milled. So we're very careful anymore on how we approach our customer base at Bow and Arrow. So the drought has affected us here in Southwest Colorado. We've got to deal with it like everybody else has to. We've been looking into some certified hemp seed. It's not easy to find. We've done some research, and in Europe or UK, there might be some certified seed that the tribal leadership would like us to look into. But at the same time, you've got to be very careful with a lot of people that are interested or doing that type of business. So there is a possibility that we are looking for crops that use less water. Right now, we may possibly be able to grow 500 acres of corn And it's a lot different than years back when the water was available and it wasn't an issue to put 500,000 bushels in our bins. Now it's a concern if we can put 100,000. Will it end? I think so, possibly in the near future. But if not, I think everybody needs to address water usage. We've been able to keep employees busy at Farm and Ranch with putting up new center pivots, sprinkler systems. We've done some re-nozzle packaging through the NRCS equip. We're putting some turbines in with the micro hydro through the Colorado Ag Department. We're putting in some turbines that will help us when we do receive our full water allocation, that will help with our electric bill and the peak times when we're running the mill. We can run these turbines, and in turn will be a benefit to the tribe and a footprint that'll be left for the tribe to utilize. This power can't be sold outside, but it can be used within our facility here at the enterprise. So we are right now in the position of putting in some turbines. We're on our number 7 pivot out of 10 this year. And we had 12 re-nozzle packages, and we've went from 8.1 gallons down, and we tried to do 6.8. It's not going to work. If anybody's familiar with our location here on in the desert, you have a problem with the system, you won't get caught up. It'll just be too hard to get back on track on our water needs. So we've settled in at 7.5 gallons to the acre on our new re-nozzle packages. So that helps us in return try to utilize what water we do have. We have what they call a EDS, which is the energy dissipation station, that is located when you enter Reach 3, which is on the reservation, and it gives us a count of what water we've been using. And we've tried through the years to be good stewards of what water is being brought down through the Toa-Kailang Canal, which the Dolores Water Conservancy District at this time monitors and do a very, very good job, because it takes 24 hours for us to get our water that 39 miles. And we have very little spillage, very little issues, unless there's a power outage. And they have battery backups at the check stations. But I think all in all, receiving water that far onto the Ute Reservation, the Dolores Water Conservancy District do a very good job on delivering water to the farm here. Now, what we're dealing with here recently is, like I said earlier, the cattle now are calving, and there is a place for them to go this summer. And the question will be if there'll be any feed to be able, or how much feed, I should say. There will be some feed to bring the bow and arrow herd back to the farm this winter. As far as bow and arrow, we've taken that value added, and it's different than the sweet corn, because we've able have a longer shelf life now. We're able to put a product together in 24-ounce packages back into the retail. A few years back, we went the direction of the larger grocery chains, Walmart's, Kroger's, Albertsons, Safeways, and it was too competitive. And the amount of money that came back to us, being where we were at, was not beneficial to pay what bills we have and any maintenance that is at the mill itself. So we backtracked and are going to more mom and pop stores and different chefs, like Chef Yazzie in Minnesota, or Red Feathers in Albuquerque, and different areas that are we're able to produce less corn for more money. And it's not organic, and we can't compete in our area. It's very labor intensive. So we can provide a non-GMO product to people that are a little bit more concerned maybe about what their diet consists of. So at this time, we concentrate more on the value added for whole grain, non-GMO corn milled product, not necessarily a whole grain, a whole corn. So that's kind of the step that we've made to a more valuable, an added product that people can utilize. Our emphasis for many years was the alfalfa, because that was the king. That's where the profitability was. And until we can get back to that, we really got to concentrate now on the bow and arrow brand for employment, and what little corn we can grow and what other crops we can utilize that take less water. We've already addressed our nozzles, and we've decreased our nozzle sizes as much as we can. We have very little runoff. We are in an area where elevation changes a lot from where we receive our water to the edge of, we have 6 different blocks. As you can see a map behind me that's color coded, and that map was an indication of what the fields at the time the 110 were planted to. Now, last year's map, there's a lot of fallow ground. So there's some mention today on weed control. If we don't do nothing with our pivots that aren't able to produce a crop, then we are in dire straits trying to control the weeds. If it be spraying them, right now we've chose to keep our tractors running, keep our discs moving, and keep the weed suppression down. And everybody knows how much the cost of fuel is right now. So we've got, we don't want to see this farm go in reverse, but we're going to deal with this situation that I've been given with the drought at Farm and Ranch, grow what crops we can, utilize our water to the best of our ability, and provide a product to bow and arrow that seems to be that customer base is growing, just like it had for our alfalfa customers. If we had more alfalfa, we could sell more alfalfa. Now we're in a position, if we had more corn, we could sell more corn. So we're going to deal with that as we progress and move forward. We did add here a color sorter at the mill. And once again, that has to pertain to how we're going to utilize this corn within the corn mill facility. It's a state-of-the-art. You put a corn in, and it digitally sees what type and what color of corn you want, and it'll separate it out where you have a corn color and size with no halves, no cracks, and no other colors, because there's people out there in the market that would like to have a 25-pound bag of blue corn that is all whole kernels. So we get to a point where we're doing whole corn, it'll be for specific customers. In years past, all of our corn went to the cattle producers mainly, and some other areas. Now we see our product going to different customers that make snack mixes or make a noodle mix. And like I hit earlier, maybe a chip or something that they can see value added in their product or their restaurant or something that they do. So we're becoming more of an ingredient, similar to alfalfa, where alfalfa is just an ingredient. If you're going into the dairy market, there's other items that are used other than alfalfa in that mix. And we're finding now that in our bow and arrow facility, that we're an ingredient. And is that ingredient used in the fish industry for coating? Is it a corn flour mix for your pizza? Or is it another product for that? We're finding out that there's a lot of people that are making corn tortillas, and a lot of people that like corn instead of flour, that may be the gluten-free market that might be more beneficial. Or we don't notice here in the southwest corner here on gluten, but Circle K, it means more in the coast areas, maybe California or New York. We've got customers that have come to us because of our kosher certification. So we're able to zero in on those customers. So I think moving forward through 2022, we're going to concentrate on employment with what water we do have and a customer base. Once we know our crop and water allocation here in the next 10 days, we need to know because we start watering in April. And unless there's a big change, and I don't see the jet stream changing much right now, it's where it is. If it's further north, we're gonna do what we can this year through this drought process and continue our efforts at Bow and Arrow brand, see where we're at with our Bow and Arrow cattle herd, and then whatever water allocation we have, we will deal with on our water allocation worksheet. And I think that kind of gives an overview of here in Southwest Colorado that pertains to the farming portion, the cattle portion, and Bow and Arrow brand corn mill facility. So I think my time is up, and I thank everybody for their participation and what I was able to learn today also.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Simon, for speaking with us today. I know you have an impressive operation down there, and when Retta, Greg, and I came down and you showed us that huge map of all your center pivots, it's just a complicated operation. So thank you for sharing.
You bet. Thank you.
Yeah, so it looks like we have maybe just a few short minutes for some questions. So if folks have any questions, you can type those in, or Joe, I guess you're still with us. So I think one of those first questions, if I could find it back there, I think was asking just about in your trials, how old was that alfalfa? And for the limited irrigation, how would that impact the newly planted alfalfa?
Yeah, the trials were all done on established alfalfa, at least 1 year old. Yeah, when you're establishing alfalfa, you're going to have to get to water it up and get it established to get that taproot down far enough where it can survive through those dry periods. So yeah, everything we have done so far has been on established stands.
Okay, maybe you have time for this one other question, asking on the alfalfa where irrigation was cut off after the first cutting, were you able to keep the field for an extra season due to the high number of crowns?
That study went on for 4 years in which we applied the same treatments to the same plots. It was kind of a strange study because after the first 2 years, when we cut the water off, we didn't see a whole lot of difference in yield because the plants had actually got their roots down into the water table. So it kind of fouled up some of our longer term monitoring on that project. But in theory, yes, it should allow you to keep that stand for at least one and probably several years longer than you would a normal stand.
Okay, great. And I had another question come in if Jose is still there. We had a question just asking about the difference between the WISE online system versus OpenET. If you were choosing a different one method over another for kind of evaluating that ET, do you have a recommendation of when to use which one?
Thank you. That's a good question. Yes, the WISE tool at the moment is calculating one value of ET for an average for the entire field, while the OpenET is per pixel is 100 by 100 feet, the pixel size, so you get a value. So if your field is homogeneous and you're not doing precision ag or precision irrigation, then the WISE tool will suffice, I think. And they are in the process of incorporating, as they are in the studies, incorporating some remote sensing into the near future for the WISE tool.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. I see Retta has typed in, we're not going to do the last poll, but we do have this evaluation there. If you see that in the chat, we'd really appreciate it if you took the time to fill that out. We will email that out as well to you all. So with that, thank you all for attending this. I look forward to seeing those of you who are attending the in-person next week. And again, thank you to all of our speakers.
Thank you.